Hello, Chipmunk and Chipette fans. My name is Grandy Tamias, and welcome back to another installment of Alvin and the Chipmunks Elaborations. Today's topic will be, should the Alvin and the Chipmunks characters travel more often? And to be clear, I'm not necessarily asking whether the characters should want to travel of their own volition, like, oh, they should get out more, but rather whether the stories should be about them being in a variety of distant locations. And at first glance, I know this seems like a question that I would normally save for my annual Chipmunk Adventure video, and indeed, there is some overlap that I'll get to soon. In fact, if you saw my video about ideas for potential Chipmunk Adventure sequels, I will be revisiting some of those points. However, I think there's more than enough material for this topic that applies to other continuities of the franchise, and it's actually the CGI series that inspired me to do this video, but I'll get to that in due time as well. But for the thesis of this video, I wanted to discuss the examples of how I think traveling to different locations around the world has helped the franchise, and how I feel that was kind of lost as the years went on. As far back as the Ross Bagdasarian Sr. era, Alvin, Simon, Theodore, and Dave have been traveling the globe. The year 1960 saw the release of an album called Around the World with the Chipmunks, which included a mix of original and cover songs themed around different places that they visited. These songs were also adapted into musical segments of The Alvin Show, with some of the more well-known ones, due to them getting released on DVD, being I Wish I Could Speak French, set in Paris, and O Gondoliero, set in Venice. This trend of globetrotting so early on in the Chipmunks' history stemmed from the fact that Ross Bagdasarian Sr. was a very well-traveled man, mostly in Europe due to his enlistment in the Air Force during the Second World War. In fact, the name David Seville was inspired by the city he was stationed in, Seville, Spain. And one of the songs on the album is simply titled Spain, which made for a really funny musical segment. As far as the main segments of the show were concerned, there weren't too many that involved travel. Probably the most notable example being the episode Jungle Rhythm, where they travel to Africa to gather animal sounds for use in their songs. Wait, isn't this what DJ Suki tried to do in that one episode of Trolls The Beat Goes On? Oh, and there was also the episode Alvin's Cruise, even if they were on a nondescript part of the ocean. The Chipmunks on a cruise. Sounds familiar. Throughout the 80s series, though, there were many, many more episodes where the Chipmunks, and sometimes the Chipettes, visited other countries. Sometimes for vacation, but usually as part of them going on tour. In fact, there are probably too many examples for me to list, so for the sake of time, I'm going to list off some of my favorites from the Ruby Spears animated seasons of the show. In Season 2's Royally Received, the Chipmunks go to London to perform for an orphanage, but later on they get caught up in shenanigans in Buckingham Palace and meet the Queen, presumably Queen Elizabeth II. In Maids in Japan, also in Season 2, Dave and the Chipmunks are in Tokyo, and again, shenanigans ensue when Alvin signs a contract where he and his brothers have to perform in Kabuki Theater. In Season 3's Mind Over Matterhorn, both the Chipmunks and the Chipettes are in Switzerland and make a treacherous climb to perform a concert at the top of the Matterhorn, almost dying in the process after an avalanche falls on them. But they all find their way out in the end, and the girls even start a fashion trend. Funny and kinda dark thing, the inciting reason for this episode plot happens because Alvin thought Brittany was going to commit, how do I put this delicately, Susan sidelined in a pool. Brittany's the Susan, and she was feeling sidelined because the Chipettes weren't famous in Europe like the Chipmunks were. Yeah. Also in Season 3, there was The Chipmunks Go to Washington, where the Chipmunks and the Chipettes travel to Washington, D.C. in order to get the President of the United States, presumably Ronald Reagan at the time, to stop the construction of a condominium development on Mount Placid and save the native bald eagles that live there. This episode is particularly famous in the fandom for Alvin and Brittany singing a cover of Up Where We Belong. And while the events of this episode may not have been an international trip for the Chipmunks, it's far enough away from their home in California that I'll include it here. Same can also be said for Season 1's The Curse of Lon-Tiki, set in Hawaii. I suppose you could also count the Chipette story, which is partially set in Australia before moving to New York. Oh, and the girls would visit New York again in the episode Little Worm in the Big Apple, which was also the last appearance of the Chipmunks' not-uncle, Harry. And taking inspiration from the Alvin Show, there are also 2 episodes in the first 5 seasons that are set, or partially set, on cruise ships. Season 1's The Cruise, and Season 5's Island Fever. In the latter episode, the Chipmunks and the Chipettes fall off of their cruise ship and wash up on a nearby island. Sounds familiar. The island itself is never given a specified location, so it's hard to say if this was another international adventure or if they were still in US territory. Now, on to the Chipmunk Adventure. I don't think I need to introduce this movie. Odds are, if you've been following this series for long enough, you know that this is the movie where the Chipmunks and the Chipettes travel around the world in hot air balloons. Of the places that they visit during the montage, the boys go to Mexico City, Machu Picchu in Peru, Rio de Janeiro, Morocco, and Venice. The girls, meanwhile, visit Bermuda, then move on to most of Europe, including London, Paris, Rome, Pisa, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Germany. Then, of course, they all meet up in Athens for the best part of the movie, before the Chipettes move on to Cairo, where they get caught and get their Princess Leia slave outfits. Then later, they go to Antarctica to return the baby penguin, before going to rescue the boys in Fiji. And then, of course, they all go back to Los Angeles for the finale. That's all of the places that they visited in the final cut of the film, but in a draft of the film's screenplay, discovered by moi, some locations are added, switched around, or replaced. For instance, there's the infamous Russia scene, which I still feel uncomfortable talking about, given events that are still going on in the world. But I do want to mention that instead of the Chipettes going to Bermuda, it was originally going to be the Chipmunks. And instead of Bermuda, it was Barbados. 2 islands in the Atlantic that start with B. What's the difference, am I right? Ross and Janice probably thought. Ironically, the production of the movie ended up traveling to more countries than the characters in the movie did. Post-Chipmunk Adventure, there were some episodes that involved international travel. Not nearly as often as the first 5 seasons, but this era did include my favorite episode of the whole series, Wings Over Siesta Grande from Season 6. I've made it clear before that I love this episode for the fact that it shows more individuals of the Chipmunks' species, in this case, the Tweetwee tribe. But another thing that I love this episode for is the adventure aspect, and how they make great use of the episode setting. In this case, Mexico. Sure, they already went there in the movie, but that was Mexico City. This time, they're in a more jungly part of the country, in a fictional seaside town called Siesta Grande, which means Big Nap in Spanish. But yeah, I love Wings Over Big Nap and how it utilizes its different elements like the mystery behind the tribe, the journey through unfamiliar terrain, and some pretty memorable one-off human characters. I've said this before, but I think that Digby should be brought back as a villain in a new reboot. Maybe they could play up his connection to archaeology and ancient chipmunks, which would give the boys a credible reason to go up against him. There's so much potential. And honestly, as much as I love the premise of the Chipmunk Adventure, I think Wings Over Siesta Grande could have been stretched to feature length and been that movie instead. Which, if it had, it could have had the opportunity to cement some of those elements like Digby and the Tweetwee tribe as memorable and integral parts of the Alvin and the Chipmunks franchise going forward. Then again, elements of the real film have rarely ever been revisited, as Claudia has never been brought back, and there have only been some subtle references in newer media. But had they focused on one location like Mexico, they could have left open more options for potential sequels, instead of knocking out most of the world in one movie. And something I sort of talked about in my TCA sequels video is the fact that because they did visit so many locations in the original film, focusing on only one location in a sequel might seem like a downgrade, even if it is more fleshed out. Actually, now that I think about it, they could have compromised. Like, maybe instead of the entire world, Claudia's smuggling ring was only limited to Europe, and they just focused on that continent. It also would have had more opportunities for Dave to, almost, run into the boys and think that they've been following him around Europe. And then they could save Mexico, South America, or a big American city, or potentially other options, for sequels. One other post-Chipmunk Adventure travel episode that I want to mention is Season 7's The Wall, where the boys visit the, at the time, divided East and West Germany. This is another episode that's pretty well known in the fandom, in this case for a scene where they perform a rock concert at the Berlin Wall and cause it to collapse. The craziest thing is that this episode was released in December of 1988, almost a full year before the Berlin Wall would be destroyed in real life in November of 1989. Now, the events of this episode were just a dream by Alvin, so the Chipmunks didn't canonically contribute to the collapse of the USSR and the end of the Cold War in their timeline, but this doesn't make it any less crazy. And it's hard to really appreciate how poignant this must have been back in the day. Getting back on topic, I'm not going to count any travels that the Chipmunks and Chipettes had in the Go to the Movies episodes too much, as they were just playing characters within fiction and didn't actually go there. Skipping ahead to the live-action movies, the first one in 2007 was, for the most part, set entirely in Los Angeles. Sure, the Chipmunks do go on tour across the US in the Coast to Coast montage, but we don't actually see those locations beyond the concert venues, if that. This remains largely the same in the sequel, except for the concert at the beginning and the scenes where Dave is in the hospital in Paris. And it isn't until Chipwrecked where we get a major change in scenery. As I've said before, this is my favorite of the live-action movies, and the lack of pre-established locations like the Seville House and Jet Records is a major reason why. As I alluded to earlier, this movie adapts previous cruise ship episodes of the franchise, with the most influence being drawn from Island Fever. Because the island is so far removed from civilization, many of the challenges that the Chipmunks and Chipettes face are natural and much less predictable than the first world problems that they'd experience at home. That's not to say that they don't have conflicts with each other, or in Alvin's case, himself, as I did a video on, but they're all tied in some way to the island, even if it is in some small ways, like amplifying their already stressful predicaments. And while we don't know where on Earth Chipwrecked Island is, geographically, the real-life filming location of Hawaii did make for a beautiful stand-in. In Road Trip, though, the story is once again limited to the United States, but they do a lot more interacting with the places that they visit. Like, they are trying to get on the move to Miami, but part of that involves stopping in Texas, my home state, to perform a concert for a bar. Likewise, for New Orleans, they were trying to earn money for bus rides, but still stopped to take part in the Mardi Gras. Unfortunately, they don't do a lot of local culture stuff when they get to Miami on account of them being grounded, but at least the trip there had some fun moments like the Sevilles going to Chuck E. Cheese. Earlier in the film, though, it was established that Dave wanted the Chipmunks to start growing up more like normal children instead of rock stars who perform in different cities every night. This is amended near the end of the film, where he still allows them to perform, but only locally, killing any potential for them to go traveling for music-related purposes. Which doesn't really matter anymore since the movie continuity is long since over, but for what it is, I think that the live-action Chipmunks made some pretty good story use out of their travels. The idea of the Chipmunks only being limited to local performances would also be used in the 2015 series, at least until the final episode where they go on tour, though we don't see the result of that due to the show's cancellation. And while I do understand from Dave's perspective why he was reluctant to let the Chipmunks perform nationally or internationally, I can't help but argue that the lack of traveling really hurt the series. The local performance thing aside, there is also another reason why the 2015 series incarnation of the characters didn't travel much, and it wasn't necessarily for a lack of motive to get them to go places. Because Alvin and the Chipmunks was animated with CGI, new maps and models were costly to produce. And this show had a smaller budget than most other shows like it around that time. That's not to say that they didn't try putting the characters in new places, but many of them were, again, nondescript, and most of them were implied to be not very far from where the Chipmunks and Chipettes live. Which itself is also nondescript.
Yeah, it just seemed like we always sort of keep that vague. It's kind of like, where do the Chipmunks live? And it's kind of any town USA is kind of our answer.
But it's fairly obvious that they live in Southern California, more specifically the town of Santa Barbara, where Bagdasarian Productions is headquartered in real life, as evident from the school resembling Santa Barbara High School. Aside from the Seville House neighborhood, the school, and the town, there are some landscapes that are reused from time to time, like the deciduous forest in episodes like Summer Camp, Treasure Hunt, and Girls' Night Out. There is a desert that looks similar to Monument Valley in the episode Excavation Vacation, which was previously used for a dream sequence in the episode Deserted, both instances being from Season 5. That season also had the episode Castle Catastrophe, which introduced a castle that was later reused in A Knight's Tale, with the events of the former being mentioned in the latter as one of the few times that the show made use of continuity from prior episodes. There's also a ski slope used in the episodes Dave Rebooted, Theodore's Calling, and Yeti or Not, which I will come back to in a moment. Really, aside from dream sequences or simulations, there were only a handful of locations that were made specifically for one episode. The two most notable examples that I can think of are the pier used in Life of the Party and Santa's workshop in A Very Merry Chipmunk, both from Season 4. In fact, I think that episode had the most distant location that any of the Chipmunks, in this case Theodore, ever traveled to in the show. To the show's credit, though, California has some diverse scenery in real life that can easily be reached within a few hours' drive. For instance, in Theodore's Calling, Miss Kroner takes Theodore on a dune buggy ride through a desert, which was mostly a simple backdrop and not a model, and to the aforementioned ski slope. And wouldn't you know it, California has deserts with these kinds of rolling dunes and mountains with year-round snow within driving distance of Santa Barbara. A rather long drive, but still doable. so at least the reused locations in that episode made sense. However, while new locations did become more common in the later seasons, and some of the more frequent ones, like the forest, at least fit the atmosphere of the episodes, their close proximity to the Chipmunks' residence made it feel like that they were living in a bubble. And because of the nondescript nature of the series, we didn't get to see any of California's larger and more recognizable cities, let alone any other big cities from around the United States or the world. Which, as I said, would have been costly to animate and redundant to do if they were only going to use them once. The Christmas episode, at least in part, got away with that because it's a fantasy location without any specific real-world landmarks. And with the way that Ross Bagdasarian Jr. talked about keeping the show's main location vague, it really makes it seem like the intention was to make the show more accessible to international audiences. If the characters made it explicitly clear that they are from California, there could be a concern that they may not be as relatable in the way of, hey, I could be from anywhere, just like you. Personally, I don't buy it. Not only do they do a crappy job of keeping the California thing a secret anyway, especially if you know the franchise's roots, but it makes the locations feel less alive, for lack of a better word. Heck, the 80s series got away with it, so I don't see why it wouldn't work again. And just because a character may be unrelatable because of where they're from, which itself is a dubious argument, doesn't make them uncompelling. That would be like trying to make where Black Panther and his associated characters live ambiguous, even though Wakanda and African culture are integral to those characters. But assuming that money was no object, and Bagdasarian Productions were again willing to make it known that the characters are traveling to real and culturally significant parts of our world, there are many places that I wish the CGI series had visited and hope that they do visit in a future reboot. For the CGI series, I kind of wish that they had made more use of the fact that Theodore was shown to be learning Spanish in the Season 1 episode, Slippin' Through My Fingers. Perhaps they could have visited one of many Spanish-speaking countries, and Theodore could have been their interpreter. I think something like that would have really helped make Theodore more important because, while he did get a lot of spotlight episodes in the series, they didn't really expand on his character. Speaking of Spanish-speaking countries, I would love it if the Chipmunks and/or Chipettes visited Mexico again, maybe if the franchise brings back the Tui tribe, or just to go on vacation. But I would even more so love it if they went to, and you probably saw this coming if you got the hint earlier, Peru. Yep, I will be shamelessly biased. This is half the reason I made this video. I wish that they had spent more time there in the Chipmunk Adventure. Would have been cool had they gone there in the CGI series, but I definitely want a whole story of a future reboot episode or even a movie centered on the Chipmunks going to Peru. Heck, the Transformers did it, and now Paddington as well. And as someone who's been to Peru, check out this video if you haven't, seriously, it's some of my best work on the channel, I say it's one of those places that has to be on everyone's bucket list. Yes, even for cartoon rodents. But I wouldn't just want them to visit Cusco and Machu Picchu. I'd want them to explore the streets of Lima as well. Theodore would for sure love the ceviche. Oh wait, the Chipmunks are vegetarians, forgot about that. Well, yeah, there's a lot of other foods that Theodore would enjoy as well. Another country that I could potentially see an Alvin and the Chipmunks story set around would be Australia. Not just for encountering the wildlife and viewing amazing landscapes, which apply to most of these places, but also for the lore potential. No modern Alvin and the Chipmunks story has ever retold the origin of the Chipettes, which, as I briefly touched on earlier in the 80s series, involved them being from Australia. Then again, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense in that original origin that the Chipettes never had Australian accents, although I guess they could have lost them after being in America for long enough. Really, there was no reason that they had to be from Australia. It was more so just a reference to Olivia Newton-John. But hypothetically, if the Chipettes ever went back, they could delve more into their origins, like why they were in Australia in the first place. Were they born there? Did their biological parents live there? Oh, that does remind me, there was also the episode Simon Seville Superstar in the 80s series where the boys did go to Australia. Although, while I'm still talking about hypothetical origin expansion stories, that is personally one of my more favorite excuses for why the Alvin and the Chipmunks characters would want to travel. Again, much like in Wings Over Siesta Grande. Showing that there are other chipmunks around the world and the characters wanting to get in touch with their heritage by traveling there would make for some really interesting stories in my opinion. Especially if there was influence drawn from ancient human cultures, the way that the Tui tribe resembled the Aztecs. Perhaps if Alvin and co. do go to Peru, they could learn that there were chipmunks who interacted with the Inca culture. And yes, I know that real chipmunks don't live in South America, but I can easily suspend my disbelief on that, or they could easily say that this anthropomorphic variety of chipmunk expanded their geographic range. Though if we are sticking to something more realistic in that regard, perhaps there could be ancient chipmunks who interacted with the indigenous peoples of North America or Siberia, since there is a species of Siberian chipmunk. To sort of circle back to that only local performances thing in Road Trip and the 2015 series, I really hope that that does not remain in place for the next reboot and the franchise as a whole going forward. Sure, going on tour is not the only excuse that the characters could use to travel, but is the most convenient. Beyond just the thrill of sightseeing, getting away from the tedium of being in the same city for so long would probably feel much needed by the characters every once in a while. And the way that the Chipmunks and the Chipettes interact with different cultures can not only teach the audience more about those places in real life, but can also serve as good ways to expand on their characters. Not to mention, it adds an extra layer of conflict or entertainment value when Alvin causes shenanigans abroad. Travel has been important to the Alvin and the Chipmunks franchise since the beginning, and there's a lot of value in those different places and the experiences that they bring that I don't want lost on future shows, films, and even the music. In fact, I really like when the Chipmunks incorporate different regional styles of acoustics in their songs. So hopefully, if Bagdasarian Productions are still going to be involved with the next reboot, they reconsider letting the Chipmunks and Chipettes tour internationally again and setting new stories primarily around one or a few new locations. Feel free to let me know in the comments. Would you like Alvin and the Chipmunks to involve more traveling? What are your favorite places that they visited in the past? And what places would you like them to visit or explore more of? As always, I'm open to suggestions for future topics of Alvin and the Chipmunks Elaborations, and if you want to follow me outside of my videos, you can join my Discord server or follow me on Twitter. Links to both will be in the description. With all that said, I hope you enjoyed, have a nice day, and thank you for your time.